learned as I've gone through life. And I've narrowed it down to luck, timing, and opportunity. And I guess if you can go through life and make the most of the luck, use the timing to your advantage, and take every opportunity that comes your way. I was raised in Christchurch, and my school had its annual military week meeting at the school playground, which was quite near where I lived. So I would go home for lunch, and my mother would give me the sandwich and all that stuff. And then I would go back to marching and saluting and all that thing. And on this particular day, the officer in charge asked all us cadets who were all wearing our military type uniform, and my mother had given me a couple of my father's prized nectarines, so I slipped them inside the pockets of my blouse jacket. And the first task when I got back was to crawl through this barbed wire hoop down the other end, and of course you go through using your elbows and toes to get to the other end. And when I came out, the officer in charge says, "You, boy, with all the blood down the front, off to the Red Cross tent." Now, I saw that as an opportunity to spend the rest of the afternoon talking about health matters and Red Cross work if you happen to join the army. And the nurse was a rather attractive young lady, not much older than me, and we spent the afternoon chatting while all my schoolmates were out there marching. The first job I had when I left school, because my best two subjects were English and science, and the first job opportunity that came my way was to be assistant to the industrial chemist at the local tannery at Woolston, which is a short bike ride from where I lived in St. Martin's. I must have started on the first of the month, because I started on a Friday, and my boss said when it came to morning tea time, "Go next door to where the dispatch men are, they're having their smoke out, and introduce yourself." So I did that, and I went through, and he said, "Oh, so you're the new laddie then? What do you reckon about the horses?" And he thrust this best bets into my hand, and he said, "What do you know?" And of course I was 17, I knew everything. And I opened it up, and there was trotting it out into the next day, and the only name I could pronounce was called King's Castle. So I said, "Oh, my people tell me King's Castle is worth a bet." Two significant factors. My people means I can blame someone else if it comes unstuck, or I must have the inside running on horses. Anyway, the next day, Saturday, the race with King's Castle running, the fellows in the dispatch department burst into laughter when I said King's Castle, because they looked up their best bets, and his track record was 0, 0, 0, 0. Anyway, the race had all the horses that were any good out the front, and King's Castle was plodding along at the back, and there was a great crash at the front. And there was drivers and sulkies and horses in all directions, made a right mess. And of course King's Castle comes plodding around the outside and comes in and wins and pays 100 to 1. Next morning, I go into the dispatch department at morning tea, and I said, "Who made any money on King's Castle? Put your hand up." Not a single hand went up. So I said, "Well, don't you ever ask me for a bet tip again, because you don't take any bloody notice." I was able to coast through on that for about the next 12 months. Unfortunately, the company, Woolston Tanneries, hit a bad spot, and the company closed. And about 65 of us were all out of work, my boss included. Now, he was a Master of Science in leather technology. It took him 6 months to get a new job, and he finished up at Allsbrooks. He had to learn food technology from the ground floor up. So while his leather knowledge was worth nothing, he had to learn food technology. And the first lesson I learned out of that lot was, don't stick with an industry where if you change employer, you've got to start and learn the whole subject all over again. So I switched from science to my English knowledge, and I got a job in an advertising agency. My boss was a tall, skinny version of Delboy Trotter. He taught me a lot. He showed me how to make advertisements for newspapers and magazines, and how to make radio commercials. Back in those days, the recording was made on a wax disc, and really it was, if you had a fluffed experience, you had to bring out a whole new disc, which somebody had to pay for. And so therefore, I liked working with Bernard Kearns. He was a real professional. We used to call him first take Bernard, because he'd read through the script I'd given him, and he'd suggest a couple of changes, because sometimes you can't always pronounce some of the words. I have the same problem with probably, so I now change it to most likely. Anyway, so after about a year of working with Jack Irwin, I decided that I had quite a nice portfolio of examples of my work, and really, when my 21st birthday came, I was ready to share my knowledge with the whole wide world. So I went to Sydney, as New Zealanders do, on the big OE, got a job, and I was living out near the airport in Sydney, but I was working on the North Shore. So every day I went across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, most beautiful harbour. I'm looking out the window of the train while everybody else is reading their Sydney Morning Herald, and I think to myself, you're wasting a wonderful opportunity to see this lovely harbour and to enjoy seeing other people. Anyway, I spent about a year with the North Shore place, and I'd saved up £1,000. And one of my work colleagues said, why don't you, where's your money? I said, it's in the Commonwealth Bank, earning 3%. Oh, he says, I've invested in some shares in one of these new experimental oil drilling well places. And I'm getting 7%. So I thought, well, 7% beats 3%. So he gave me the phone number, the name and phone number of his broker. He said, ring this fellow and he can sort you out. Anyway, I rang, it must have been 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And the telephonist said, oh, I'm sorry, but Mr. So-and-so has gone home for the weekend. That weekend, Mooney Ponds discovered oil in Queensland. And every single share, which was £1, went up to £100. Even those who didn't have a well, their shares went up. Meanwhile, my £1,000 is sitting in the bank. So the lesson to be learned is, when it's all about timing, and if you get an opportunity, see if you can get some action straight away about it all. So I had my first week's pay packet, and I went to David Jones' department store in Sydney, and I was amazed, because coming out of Christchurch, yes, we have Valentine's, nice store, and Beth and DIC and all that, but I was amazed at the range of stuff in David Jones' department store. And there, through the glass, I found my new friend. We lived together, and we shared the next 50 years together. So really, it was a wonderful experience for me. After I'd had enough time in Sydney, I decided to go to Melbourne. I thought, well, Melbourne is, just excuse me a moment. That's better. Melbourne is exciting because they have the Melbourne Cup. And one of my colleagues down there said, last time when I was at the Melbourne Cup at Flemington, this elderly lady, that must have been part of the Red Hat Brigade, because she was out there with all her friends and all dressed up. Of course, they all dress up to the nines for Melbourne Cup. And anyway, a great gust of wind came, and this elderly lady, she put her hands up to protect her hat, and of course the wind blew her skirts up, Marilyn Monroe style, and her friend said, "Oh, Mabel, you saved your hat, but you showed everything you've got to the rest of Melbourne." She said, "Everything down there is 74 years old. This hat is brand new." I liked Melbourne right up to the point until the big boss from Sydney came down to the agency where I was working in Melbourne. He did a head count and he said to my boss, "You've got one person too many for the budget. Last in, first out." That was me. So I was fired with almost no notice. But then that's what happens sometimes. Anyway, I was so brassed off with that, I went across the road to the travel agent. I said, "When's the next boat leaving?" We all travelled by boat in those days. And they said, "Oh, where to?" "I don't care where to, I just want to be on it." So I bought a ticket on the Flotta Laura, which left in the morning, and I was, "Oh, by the way, where's it going?" "It's going to Italy." "Oh, good." I didn't care where it was going as long as I was on it. So I met a lovely young man on the boat. He was a German immigrant who had bounced back. He'd come out with his family from Germany. They all settled in Sydney and then into Melbourne. And he didn't settle. He's one of these, they call them the yo-yos. They bounce back from the old country where they leave to the new country where they try to make a new life, and then they bounce back again. This can go on. So he was on a bounce back to Berlin, which was his hometown. He and I taught him how to play chess, and it turned out that later on, when he got the hang of it all, he became quite a good chess champion. So I must have contributed something to his lifestyle. We got as far as Suez, and we both took this is me and my friends, we took the bus up to Cairo because it was part of the package that you can sign up for. And we saw the pyramids. I did not ride the camels, that was going to cost too much money. And I went into the Cairo Museum. I have never seen so much gold in all my life as in that Cairo Museum. And of course they've got the treasures like Tutankhamun's mask and Nefertiti's head and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so the other thing about the pyramids, those stones are not just like bricks stacked one upon the other. They are fitted together like that, and if you can imagine a jigsaw puzzle made out of stones, you couldn't even slip a knife blade between them. That's how clever they were. But they didn't have power tools, so I don't think anyone really knows how they did it all. So we got off the boat in Naples. It was going on to Genoa, but we didn't want that. So we got off in Genoa. We bought a ticket from Genoa through to Berlin, one that allowed us to stop wherever we wanted to. So we spent some time in Rome. The Pope wasn't in residence at that time because it was the middle of summer, and he goes up to Castel Goldolfo, which is his country house up in the hills, which is cool. So I think it was Pope John Paul the 23rd or something like that, we saw him. And we went through Florence and saw David and all that sort of thing. We finished up getting as far as Berlin, and that's where Jürgen stayed with his the remainder of his family there. I decided that I would like to have a look at East Germany. Now, this is a very risky thing to go into the east because the Berlin Wall was up, and I knew that going through to the east, I had to go through Checkpoint Charlie, but I also registered with the British people that I was going into East Germany, and they said, well, make sure you tell us when you come out again, otherwise we get a bit worried about you. particularly Kiwis who don't know how to follow all the rules. That was the time when Peter Fechter, who was an East German building the wall, he decided to escape, and he clambered up over the barbed wire, and he got to the top when they shot him and killed him. He just hung there for 3 days as a warning to other people, don't try to escape. On the other side, on the western side, there was a lot of flowers brought to mark the spot where Peter Fechter had been killed. Not as many as for Princess Diana's funeral and flower display, but certainly a lot of flowers, because to the Westerners, Peter Fechter was unsuccessful in his escape, but he was an example of people who wanted to live in the free world, but didn't quite make it. Of course, the Russians had the advantage over the Americans in those days because they put the Sputnik up, and I can remember many years earlier lying on my back on the grass at night looking up and seeing this going across the sky, and that was the Sputnik, the first item which had escaped Earth's gravity. All very interesting stuff. And of course the Americans, the Russians had put Yuri Gagarin up, and he had a circuit around the Earth in his spaceship. And the Americans put John Glenn up. I think John Glenn made 3 circuits, and before he came down had a career in politics. Now, Yuri Gagarin's interesting because the Russians saw him as their great hero and also as an example of their technical prowess. So they, after he'd come back, he was a fighter pilot by training, but they refused to let him go into his fighter plane because they didn't want him to be either shot down or to crash. But he did crash his plane at some stage under very mysterious circumstances. Nobody really knows what happened because he was obviously a trained pilot. But anyway, they wanted to keep him as a showpiece. My friend, the one from David Jones, told me in 1962 that Marilyn Monroe had died, aged 36, a drugs overdose. That was very sad, particularly for the blokes I knew, because she was Marilyn Monroe, wasn't she? That was the time also when the first of the James Bond films came out. I saw it in Gibraltar. It was Dr. No. And I'm convinced to this day that that first James Bond film, that James Bond was killed. But of course, Gibraltar was a test bed for filmmakers. Small, tightly knit English community. They could test their films there, much like we have things tested in New Zealand. But anyway, of course, the James Bond films went on and on and on. I've got a feeling they're into their 20s by now. I had a ticket which would get me in America on the Greyhound bus. $99 for 99 days of bus travel. Stop when you want to stop, catch the next bus going through. I thoroughly enjoyed doing all of that. I lived in San Francisco, and I was very fortunate. I ran out of money. I went to the New Zealand consulate because I'd heard that if you plead poverty, they will pay for a ticket to get you back to New Zealand, which you can then repay when you're back home. But when I was in the waiting room, there was a sign up on the door, on the notice board saying, office helper wanted with some chauffeuring duties. And I thought, this is an opportunity. I either ask for the ticket home or I take this opportunity. I don't know to this day how I managed to get an American driving license when I had no money, but I did somehow. Anyway, I got the job as a chauffeur, and I was taking my boss, the Consul General, around. Now, there were about 50 or 60 consulates in San Francisco, and that means that every week somebody was having their National Day, which of course means lots of drinkies and so forth. And I made this arrangement with my boss. I said, look, where are you going? Oh, going to the Iceland National Day luncheon. Oh, that'll be interesting. So I drove him to the front door. He gets out, and I said, what time do you think you might be out? Oh, he's around about 2 o'clock. Now, we had this special arrangement whereby I said, now, when you come out, I can see you, but you won't see me. And when you think you've had enough of the old, nice to see you, Fred, and goodbye, see you next time, I said, you bring out your handkerchief, and you just go like that. That's my signal to come and pick you up. And of course he said, oh, here's my car, so I'm off. So that was a good arrangement we had. I was listening to the radio, and Walter Cronkite said, we interrupt this program to bring you the sad news that President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas at 12:30. And of course that was a real shake-up for the Americans, that they should have somebody shoot their president. It was a bit of a, well, it just was a significant matter. About the same time, of course, the Beatles, 1960s, Beatles had gone across to America, and they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. That was their first exposure to the American audience. The Americans loved the Beatles. They just took to them in a all that shouting and carrying on that they did. It was also the time when, and my friend from David Jones was telling me all this, that Sonny Liston, who was the boxing champion of the day, was being challenged by Cassius Clay, the one who had the big mouth, and he was only aged 22, but he had won a gold medal at the Olympics. So he was considered to be a bit of a long shot in terms of this boxing match. But as you will know, Cassius Clay beat Sonny Liston. Eventually he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. And I saw Muhammad Ali in London when I'd moved at some stage to, oh yes, that's right, I met my future wife. That was the reason I went back to London. But I saw Muhammad Ali coming out of a hotel. And I mean, in those days, I was just under 6 foot. He was about this much taller than me, and a significant athlete. Oh, he really was a beauty to see. Now, for those of you who follow athletics, to see somebody who's in the prime of their life, it is good to see. I was in London, and I can remember somebody saying that you can't always assume that the man you see or hear on the radio is actually Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, because there's a fellow called Norman Shelley who sounded like Winston Churchill. So whenever during the wartime particularly, whenever the British forces wanted to have Winston just did whatever he, like Trump, he sort of did whatever he wanted, and didn't care about the rules or what other people had arranged. So Winston Churchill might go off to the desert to see the troops, but Norman Shelley would be back in London saying, you know, tonight I'm bringing you news of the Little War. And this was Norman Shelley speaking while Winston was way over there somewhere. That great photograph of Winston Churchill, the one where he looked so grumpy, was taken by Karsh, the Canadian photographer. And apparently Winston, they said, well, Mr. Karsh, you've got about 5 minutes to take your photograph because the Prime Minister must be elsewhere. Anyway, there's Winston sitting in his chair looking just ordinary, smoking his cigar. And Karsh went over and pulled the cigar out of his mouth and went back and clicked the photograph. And that's why he's got that grumpy look on his face. The one which became quite famous. Life is about taking opportunities. Back when I was in Christchurch. I took the opportunities that came my way, and that's why the sort of life I led it took me to some interesting places. When I was working in Auckland, my boss at that time, I'd gone to him and said, look, this chap from America called Clyde Bedell, he's an expert in mail order marketing, and I would like to go to his lecture. Well, you can't have the time off. And I said, well, I'm due a little bit of holidays. I'd like to take one of those days as the day when Clyde Bedell was giving his lecture. Well, it doesn't suit us. So that was telling me this was the time to leave. And so it was either not go to Clyde Bedell, not take that opportunity, or whatever the other thing was. And the other thing was I left that employment, started my own advertising agency, and did that for about 10 years until I got the feeling that it was time for another change. And I started an education institute, just from a standing start virtually. And first student I remember was, I've forgotten his name now, but anyway, he was the first student. I had, in that time, I've written 34 books. They're all on Amazon, so I don't have any books of mine cluttering up my garage like a lot of people. My friend Richard Webster gave me some good advice. He said, I get the same royalty whether I write a big book or a small book. And I thought, oi, thank you, Richard. So I only write small books. They might be 10 pages, 30 pages. I think the longest one is about 40 pages, and that's a complete book. The people who say, oh, I'm writing a book, I've been working at it now for 5 years, I think, oh no, that's far too long to spend on one book. So my books are on Amazon. I sell them at $1 each, because I don't want people to say, oh, I'd like to read your book, but I couldn't afford $29.99, so I didn't buy it. I'd much rather they say, oh, $1, oh, that's, you can't even get a cup of coffee for $1 these days. I've also started to write blogs, and I've written 350. I try to write a new blog every day. It's on a website called Substack, S-U-B Stack. So substack.com, and if you put Brian Morris, that's all one word, brianmorris.substack.com, you'll find my blogs are there. And that's, I think, going to be a story for another day, because we could be going on and on and on, but you've got other things to attend to. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to meeting some of you during the cup of tea break.